Shabbat Shalom. It is a pleasure, an honor, a privilege, a joy to be in a community full of so many awesome scholars, thinkers. Just really, this is truly a blessed community. As I've said before, the superpower of Beth Hillel is its lay leadership. And so, as we've done a little bit last summer and are doing again this summer, you don't need to hear from me anymore. I've said enough. So we are delighted to have a guest darshanit for us this morning, Dr. Alissa Jerud. I forgot to get your whole bio, so I don't know exactly all the things that you do, but I do know that you just published a book. So mazel tov on that, but we are delighted to have you as our guest speaker this morning and invite you to the Bima at this time to share words of Torah and wisdom with all of us. Thank you for agreeing to do this. Everybody else, you're going to get asked at some point too. So, start thinking of what you're going to say now. Thank you, Donna.
Thank you. All right. Shabbat Shalom, everyone. I am deeply honored to have the opportunity to speak with you all today, and I'd like to kick things off by giving you all a chance to speak first. I think we can all agree that it's been a very intense and stressful couple of weeks, and in a moment, I'm going to ask you to share your answer to the question, how are you feeling, with the person sitting next to you? And if you're willing, I encourage you to answer honestly, even if you're just annoyed that I'm asking you to do this or disappointed that our eloquent and inspiring rabbis won't be giving today's sermon. There's truly no right or wrong answer to this question, so please take the next 30 seconds or so to share with each other whatever emotions you happen to be feeling now. Short. I need to bring this down. I was trying to reach out. I couldn't. Yes. Awesome. All right. Thank you for indulging me with that exercise. The question, how are you feeling, is one of my favorites, but I promise that's not the only reason I wanted to start there. Given the exchanges that you all just had and maybe are still continuing to have, it's clear that there are a lot of feelings in the room at the moment. And of course there are. Whether you have friends or family in Israel or just feel a strong connection to our homeland, there's a good chance you're feeling some pretty strong emotions this morning. I know I certainly am. Now I'm going to ask you to remember the feelings you just shared if you can, because here's the thing about feelings that we sometimes forget. They're always coming and going. They're never permanent. Even if we may be especially stressed and anxious these days, chances are there are moments where our stress and anxiety become more like background noise as other emotions emerge. And my hope is that by the end of this sermon, you'll be feeling something different from or in addition to what you shared a moment ago, even if it's just relief that I'm done. Before moving on, I want to introduce myself and explain why I'm up here talking with you all today. And I also want to take a moment to give you an overview of where I'm going with this admittedly unconventional sermon. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Alissa Jerud, and I'm a licensed clinical psychologist, a clinical assistant professor at the University of Pennsylvania, and author of the new book, Emotion Savvy Parenting, a shame-free guide to navigating emotional storms and deepening connection. I specialize in highly effective evidence-based treatments for anxiety-related disorders and emotion regulation difficulties, and I'm passionate about helping people live more emotionally agile lives through my clinical work, writing, and speaking engagements such as this. Although I am by no means a Torah scholar, Rabbi Schwartzman invited me to speak with you all today, and I'm excited to dive into this week's Parsha in hopes of offering you a research-informed perspective on emotions that just so happens to come to life in the story we just read about Korach and the rebellion he led in an attempt to overthrow Moses and Aaron and grab power for himself. As you may know, God was not a fan of what Korach and his followers tried to do, and their rebellion ended shortly after it began with their rather horrific deaths. Afterward, the Israelites blamed Moses and Aaron for the rebels' demise, angering God in the process, and giving way to a plague that killed over 14,000 people before Moses and Aaron put an end to it. Of course, there's more to this story, and many different parts that we could talk about. However, the therapist in me can't help but zoom in on the emotions that make up this story and the behaviors that these feelings prompt. So that's where we're going to focus today. With that said, you may still be wondering why I care so much about emotions that I'd start this sermon by asking you all to share how you're feeling. Well, in addition to being ever-changing, our feelings also greatly impact our behavior, or at least how we want to behave. This is because all emotions give rise to act. That's why we have them. They serve an evolutionary purpose. For instance, anxiety is what compels us to look both ways when we're crossing the street. Anger leads us to stand up and fight for our beliefs and values. Disgust pulls for us to distance ourselves from things or situations that are immoral, offensive, or contaminated. And love moves us to connect. In other words, our emotions are adaptive and crucial to our survival. That said, although our emotions are incredibly valuable, it's important to note that they sometimes lead us to act in ways that aren't all that helpful or effective. Plus, as I mentioned a moment ago, all emotions are temporary and often go as quickly as they come, thus making them rather unreliable, fickle guides. Thankfully, most of us recognize this at some level and make the conscious choice to refrain from giving in to many of the urges to act that we experience when feeling uncomfortable emotions, and for good reason. After all, imagine what life, or even just Saturday mornings here, would look like if we were to allow our emotions to take the wheel at all times. I'm fairly certain that impatience and growling stomachs would result in many of us bowling over those in the kiddish line who sometimes seem more concerned with chatting than eating. Of course, we all get emotionally hijacked at times and act in ways that we wouldn't in the absence of strong feelings. This is part of being human. So if this sometimes or even frequently happens to you, please know that you aren't alone or broken because of this. That said, as we see in today's Parsha, just because we feel an intense, unwanted emotion doesn't mean we have to act on it. This is true no matter the circumstance and no matter with whom we are interacting, even if we may find it harder to remember this with some individuals than with others. So how do we go about resisting the unhelpful urges that sometimes accompany challenging emotions? First, let's talk about what ideally we don't want to do when feeling intense, painful emotions. As humans, we are wired to want to avoid pain, whether emotional or physical. And so naturally, many of us try to avoid or shove away uncomfortable emotions whenever they arise. Unfortunately, however, when it comes to emotional pain, our attempts to avoid often backfire and lead us to struggle even more. For instance, if I feel anxious when thinking about flying on a plane and decide to drive instead, that will almost surely reduce my anxiety in the moment, but will likely leave me feeling every bit as anxious the next time I need to fly. Now, when it comes to relationships, one common way many of us try to avoid emotional distress is by controlling those around us who prompt us to feel uncomfortable emotions. Yet while we may be able to get others to change some of the time, perhaps by yelling, threatening, or punishing them when they emit behaviors we don't like, oftentimes our attempts to control in these ways lead to relationship strife and sometimes even bring about more of the behaviors we were hoping to quash in the first place. Plus, each time you resort to using these sorts of tactics in an attempt to reduce our own distress, the stronger our habit of doing so becomes. What results is the faulty belief that the only way we can cope when triggered by someone else's behavior is to get that person to change. Unfortunately, this can easily become a recipe for failure and frustration, as the truth is that the only behaviors we can ever truly fully control are our own. That said, I can't stress enough how understandable this pull to control others is. In fact, not only are we wired to avoid emotional pain in ways such as this, but it's also what's modeled for us again and again throughout the Torah, including in today's Parsha. Once again, here's the gist of this week's story. Moses' cousin Korach and 250 of Korach's followers challenged Moses and Aaron's authority, arguing that all of the community were holy and that it was therefore unfair that the brothers should have more power and influence than the rest. While at first glance this might seem like a reasonable and even noble fight for equality, a closer look at the text reveals that Korach was simply claiming that he was for the people when he was really only looking out for himself. In other words, his supposedly egalitarian quest was nothing more than a cover for his plan to seize power. So what happened next? Well, since it was God who appointed Moses and Aaron as leaders, Korach's rebellion was seen as a direct challenge to God, which greatly angered him. And here's where that modeling that I talked about comes into play, because God could have done so many things with his anger. God could have taken some deep breaths, practiced mindfulness for a few minutes, or simply issued a loving but firm no to Korach's arguments. Instead, nature intercedes as a manifestation of divine wrath and kills Korach and his followers on the spot. First, the ground opens up and swallows Korach and his co-conspirators, sending them to their graves alive, and then a fire consumes the other 250 rebels. As noted previously, there's more to the story, but I want to pause here because we learn a lot from this part alone. Obviously, we learn that it's risky to anger God, but we also learn something else. Because in this part of the Parsha, God shows us how instinctual it is to punish those who anger us. Indeed, like nature, we too can be harsh and unforgiving when overcome by anger. With this in mind, it's no wonder that we might sometimes find ourselves lashing out at those who challenge, offend, or disrespect us in some way. After all, modeling is one of the most powerful teaching tools we have, and thus it's unsurprising that our approach to managing emotions tends to be greatly shaped not only by nature, but also by what others have modeled for us. Thankfully, in the very same Parsha, God presents what I consider to be a more righteous approach to managing anger, which we see in the actions of the divinely appointed leaders, Moses and Aaron. Before the deaths of Korach and his followers, Moses proposes a test designed to reveal God's choice as to who should lead the Israelites, thus settling the debate once and for all. The night before the test, Korach, convinced that God would choose him, tells all of the Israelites to come and see his triumph. The Israelites follow Korach's lead, and in doing so, anger God, who then says that he is going to kill them along with Korach and his followers. At this point, Aaron and Moses speak up and model benevolence in the face of anger, asking God to reconsider and spare the Israelites, which God agrees to do. Through his chosen leaders, God shows us not only that it's possible to refrain from acting on our angry urges, but that we can choose to take a higher, more loving and compassionate road instead. In fact, it's when we take this less intuitive path that we find our humanity. God drives this message home a little while later in the story, again through the actions of his chosen leaders. After the deaths of Korach and his followers, the Israelites blame Aaron and Moses for the rebels' grim fates, accusing them of causing the deaths of the people of God. This angers God, and a plague breaks out, killing over 14,000 people before Aaron and Moses step in and atone for the Israelites, thereby halting the plague and saving the remaining people. That's right. Even though the Israelites had essentially turned their backs on Aaron and Moses, the brothers recognized that even among family, for as Jews, we are all family, we can rise above angry urges that might lead us to act in ways that don't really align with the kind of people we want to be. In other words, through the actions of Aaron and Moses, God models a more effective approach to navigating the unhelpful urges that sometimes come with anger, thus paving the way for us to follow in their footsteps when unwanted emotions threaten to overtake us. And that provides a nice segue back to our own ever-changing feelings. Imagine for a minute what it would look like if all of us here were to follow a more peaceful path when others behave in ways that prompt intense, uncomfortable emotions in us. To be sure, I realize that this would certainly be easier said than done, as it can sometimes feel as though we have no choice but to give in to the urges that accompany our emotions. Yet as neuropsychologist and Holocaust survivor Viktor Frankl once said, between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. In other words, there's always room for us to choose a more compassionate and skillful way of relating not only to our own painful emotions, but also to others who prompt those feelings in us. That's what I help people do every day in my clinical work and in my book, Emotion Savvy Parenting, and I promise it's something you can do too. Now, for those of you who may be thinking that you don't always have the willpower to rise above painful emotions, you're right. In fact, I'd argue that no amount of willpower can reliably save us from acting on unhelpful emotion urges at all times. The good news, however, is that we don't have to rely on willpower alone, but can instead use a number of science-backed tools to help us in this regard. Since this isn't therapy, I'll save further discussion of these tools for kiddish, but we'll just note for now that these are tools that we can all learn no matter our current emotional quotient. With that said, I'd like to invite you to consider what it might be like to allow uncomfortable feelings in without letting them dictate what we do or don't do. Whether in our homes, offices, communities, or even this very synagogue, imagine for a moment what it would be like if we were all to commit to striving to show up as our ideal selves, no matter what we're feeling and no matter what's going on in the world around us. Imagine if we all made the conscious choice to treat others, including those less powerful than us, with compassion and respect, even if we might not always like or agree with what they do or say. And imagine if we were to model this way of responding to unwanted emotions in even the most challenging of moments in the most challenging of interactions with our children, thus gifting them a roadmap to one day follow as well. Keeping these imaginings in mind, I'm going to close with the very same question I opened with today in a moment, and I'm guessing that your answer will likely be at least a little different from what you shared a short while ago. After all, as I mentioned, our feelings are always coming and going. My hope is that you'll remember this whenever you feel intense, painful emotions moving forward, and know that you can allow these feelings to tag along for the ride and still choose to show up as the person you aspire to be. And when your emotions inevitably get the better of you, as happens for all of us at times, rest assured that this is a very natural human experience, and simply commit to trying to do better the next time you find yourself in a similar situation. And with that, I invite you to take a moment to reflect on how you're feeling now. Shabbat Shalom.